great session. So you are at the Migrating to Jamf Cloud in a High Compliance Environment session. So picture this. You've been happily managing thousands of Macs with a self-hosted Jamf Pro environment, and you discover that a critical third-party integration has been marked as end of life. In this session, we'll look at how a large bank in Australia approached this challenge, discussing the motivation to migrate to Jamf Cloud, what alternatives were explored, what preparation needed to be undertaken before the migration could take place. And we're also going to talk through the actual process of migration, look at how this is presented, and modernize the entire configuration journey in your high compliance environment. We will be offering Tim Tams to great questions, so looking forward to your great questions. The way this will work is 30-minute presentation, 15-minute Q&A. With that, I'd love you all to give a big round of applause for Stu and Marcus.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming along. As we said, migrating to Jamf Cloud in a high compliance environment. My name is Marcus. I'm a senior sales engineer at Jamf. I've been at Jamf since 2022, but I was a customer and integrator for nearly 15 years before that, managing Macs for way longer than I care to admit. Now, one other thing is, last time I presented at JNUC in 2018, I lost something at LAX on the way over and caused a lot of grief to my colleague who was traveling with me. So I just want for the record to say, Ashley, I still have my passport with me this time, so I'll be able to leave the country a lot easily.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Stu. I'm an infrastructure engineering consultant on the macOS platform at National Australia Bank. I've been in that role since 2019, and I've been using Jamf professionally since 2013 and managing Macs in some way, shape, or form for, again, a little bit longer than I would care to admit.
So we are going to be talking about migrating a self-hosted Jamf instance into Jamf Cloud, but it's not really just any instance. So
yeah, National Australia Bank, we are one of Australia's largest banks, and with that, we add a little bit of governance, complexity, and risk. Actually, it's a really healthy serving of governance, complexity and risk.
It's governance, it's got complexity, it's got risk. Imagine if they were just one thing.
Yeah.
So we are going to look at why the decision was made to move to Jamf Cloud and some of the other options that were explored as part of that, and then what the process looked like getting ready for that move. And then after National Australia Bank was running in Jamf Cloud, what new opportunities did that present? What's on the table? So this is a story about doing this in a very complex, regulated environment. And the idea is if we could do it in this instance, then you could do it in any of the other instances you're looking at.
So a little bit about National Australia Bank. We are the second largest bank in Australia for personal banking. We've got more than 38,000 staff members globally, but that number changes depending on who you ask and the time of the day. And we support more than 8.5 million customers, and we've got a proud 156-ish year history as one of Australia's most trusted financial institutions. In the last few years, we also picked up the title of Australia's largest business bank, which we were very proud to pick up that #1 position there. About our Mac fleet, we've been a Jamf customer since 2017, and we were self-hosted originally on-premise with some Windows on-demand infrastructure that we had through a supplier. And we moved into an AWS Terraform kind of self-hosted environment with some help from one of my very talented engineers who built all of that up. Essentially a Jamf Cloud instance, but our own self-hosted Jamf Cloud. We've got just shy of 5,000 Macs across 3 different countries and 4 dedicated engineers based in Australia. So we do run it a little bit on the lean side in terms of our engineering capacity.
So given how well that was running, why change? So what was the catalyst for the whole process even happening?
That's a really great question. And in the introduction, we talked about a critical third-party integration. And in June of 2022, we started to see this warning come up in the release notes from Jamf about Microsoft deprecating partner device management. And being a financial institution, we are using conditional access fairly heavily. And so we needed to address this and plan accordingly for the next steps and how we were going to do that, rather than just wait and hope. I'm possibly going to repeat this a few times. Hope is not a strategy. Banks are complex environments, and we can't just go around changing things without going through appropriate processes and governance and readiness reviews.
So how do we approach this? So what are the different ways we can address this situation?
Well, personally, I think it's really good practice, regardless of your situation, to take a look at all of the options for you to move forward. And for us, National Australia Bank, we made sure that there was really thorough evaluation by establishing that there were really 3 options available to us to move forward. We could, as the talk suggests, move to Jamf Cloud. We could, second of all, potentially stay self-hosted and potentially wait for a non-Jamf Cloud solution to present itself. Or the third option was then to explore an alternate MDM vendor where this may not have been a problem.
Now, it is always good to see what other options are out there. So, if only if that is to just reassure yourself that you are in fact using the correct solution.
Absolutely, and we did look at several other MDMs, and we determined that we were going to stay with Jamf for a couple of different reasons. Like, first of all, it was fit for our purpose. In a regulated environment, there's a lot of stuff that we need, and it was determined that Jamf was the best for our particular use case. We also had a lot of existing skills and experience, and not just within our internal team from a Jamf management perspective, but also access to additional skills from our trusted vendors and suppliers through managed services within Australia as well. The extensibility and customizability of a lot of the things within Jamf was really a big thing, and that helps us to achieve our regulatory compliance goals. And then also Jamf's ability and experience in dealing with financial services and these regulatory requirements as well was a big part of that.
So there was the option of waiting and seeing if a non-Jamf Cloud solution presented. So let's have a look at that. So in June 2022, the deprecation was listed for 2024, and we can see that changed over time. So it did in July this year, but by then you were well and truly in Jamf Cloud by then.
Absolutely, and looking at these timelines, they kind of became a moving target, and waiting and hoping for the on-premise solution with these kind of short deadlines, it's really not something that for an organization as large as us and complex as us with all of these hurdles that we needed to go through to get change completed, it wasn't a wise decision. And as I mentioned before, hope is not a strategy.
And then the overall process was really sort of 6 to 9 months of planning and execution. So the very short deadlines you see here would not have worked very well. So the decision was made to move to Jamf Cloud. And there's 2 ways that can happen. It can either be a database migration, where you pick and shift the existing database and that gets put in Jamf Cloud, or you can do a re-enroll of devices. So the risk of a single point in time migration being weighed up against the impact of the end users. So we have Jamf Migration, Jamf Migrate that you can see there, where we can actually orchestrate that process, but it is something that needs to be considered as to which one of these options is the right one for your environment.
Yeah, and we also needed to look at the environment that we had in place already. What was the general condition of our current Jamf instance on-prem? We took a look at it, at the health of it. It was deemed to be pretty good. It had a couple of issues, and we'll see one of those a little bit later. But also starting from scratch was going to be a lot of work. We're 6 years into our Jamf journey at this point. We've built a pretty sophisticated environment, and it's not going to get any simpler over time. And to add to some additional complexity here, our end users do not have admin privileges at all. And so a lot of work goes into ensuring that they're able to do everything that they need to be able to do to perform their role without the possibility of ever elevating privileges.
And so we spoke about the end user impact of the idea of doing that re-enrollment as well. So we've got the Jamf migration tooling, and that involves the end user being involved, and looking at having that disruption across so many users needs to be assessed in terms of business impact. Users across 3 different countries, so troubleshooting for any of the issues that may arise needs to be able to be supported there. And then also looking at things where, are you able to, do you want to keep the same URL? If you're using that database migration, the end devices need to be able to access the same URL in Jamf Cloud. There's some things that can be done in Jamf Cloud to be able to use what we refer to as a vanity URL, so that can be achieved as long as it's able to be accessed externally. So the decision was made to do the database migration. So full steam ahead. We spoke about the 6 years of work that had gone into the current state. With the benefit of hindsight, it's always worth doing things differently. So how did you approach that at National Australia Bank once we'd decided that we were going to move the database into Jamf Cloud?
Yeah, so it was important to really kind of look at the overall design that we had in place for our Jamf implementation and start to identify some opportunities to change things that were going to help benefit us. And we tried to look at the whole migration project as an opportunity to not only simplify but also modernize the platform, not just from an admin perspective, but also for our end users.
So once a decision had been made, this is where the hard work really started. So the cloud database migration is a 4-hour engagement with Jamf Professional Services. That's the easy bit. There was significantly more work required than this. So looking at all of the integrations that were currently being used on-prem and ensuring that all of those were going to function when it was in Jamf Cloud. So that was a real partnership between teams at National Australia Bank and at Jamf. And so we can see here the sheer volume of teams that were involved in this, making sure that all of that planning was understood, took place, and that everyone was really on the same page when it came to what that 4-hour migration was going to look like.
Yeah, and I do want to make special mention to our project management office. Honestly, without them, I think we'd still be talking about the migration rather than actually having completed it. They're really good at letting the engineers being good at engineering and then project managers can just be good at herding cats, or engineers in this case. One of the great things that really helped us through this process was putting guardrails around the expected timelines by scheduling and making sure that we had appropriate resourcing, and especially where that was across different teams within the organisation, and ensuring that dependencies were met prior to all of these schedules being in place. And the other great thing was that they would go to all of these different governance boards and meetings and obtain the appropriate approvals from those governance boards for us.
Really that understanding of how much work was going to be required before that database migration and how much of that was required to be done by National Australia Bank and which parts Jamf was able to look after. So we're talking about financial services here at a bank. We wouldn't be talking financial services without governance. So we do have regulatory hurdles in Australia. FedRAMP is not one of those. However, there is certain due diligence that needs to be undertaken. So there was a lot of work there to make sure that we had all of the documentation and paperwork in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a lot of internal third-party assessments that need to be gone through. There's also SOC 2 compliance to take a look at. And for us, ensuring that not just Jamf, but National Australia Bank had all of the appropriate compliance and governance requirements that were met, and the documentation and attestations were up to date to reflect everything accurately. The Jamf page there, it's security.jamf.com. Is a really great resource.
Yeah, this is not an unusual thing for us. We do this for a lot of customers, so we have all of this documentation already in place. You can go to that website, sign in, sign the appropriate NDAs and get access to all of the information you want, but then you can also work with your sales engineer, customer success, to get any additional, more specific information that you require for your organisation. So we know we have a lot to do here at this stage, and it's best practice if you've got lots of things to do to not do it all at once.
Yeah, definitely. There's so many different moving parts within this whole process that we decided that it was going to be the best to break down these changes into manageable chunks of work to really minimise not only the impact to our end users, but reduce the risk of a failure state and also enable easier identification of any issues that may have cropped up during the migration process. Because if you change 4 things and you're starting to get error messages, you don't know which of those 4 things has caused it. In our case, the other thing that was kind of important here, some of the later steps in this migration process actually had prerequisites that hadn't been met yet by the time we were getting to the first few steps. And so we had to ensure that all of the rest of these prerequisites were in place before proceeding with the next step. So prior to our 4-hour database migration engagement, we put a lot of work into cleaning things up to really try and ensure that what we're migrating to Jamf Cloud was actually relevant to us and kept to a minimum. It was an opportunity as well for us to tidy up a lot of our workflows. So we spent a fair amount of time auditing our packages, scripts, and profiles, and then the policies and smart groups that then use those packages, scripts, and profiles, and getting rid of the old cruft.
So speaking of cruft, let's talk about the database. So the database, what size was the database when we started this?
So our database was a chunky boy at over 50 gigabytes in size. Yeah.
So how did we deal with that?
Well, we kicked off with some log flushing, which helped a little. It got us down to about 40 gigabytes. But we'd seen from our engagements prior that it was best to keep most of our tables below around 1 gigabyte in size, which was, we saw a number
recommended upper limit?
Recommended upper limit, yeah. We saw a number of tables that were well and truly past that limit. So we worked with Jamf support to kind of try and identify the root cause of these issues. And then we were provided with some MySQL commands that we were able to run to then start flushing out some of this stuff. We had zombie MDM commands sitting in that database from 2017 when the database was created. I think I saw number 16 as an ID on one of those.
It's still important to keep that.
100%.
Completist, we don't want to let those go.
Absolutely.
What other tables did you see?
So we had our event log was over 10 gigabytes in size, and there were policy logs sitting there, again, also back from 2017, which we didn't really need to keep them at that point.
So a lot of cleanup went into this, and what was the outcome of that cleanup?
We did manage to get the database down to around about 10 gigabytes. So it's certainly still large, but it's a bit more manageable there. And we actually got a little bit of I'm a bit ashamed to admit this, we got a bit of an extra surprise, and we noticed that there was a bit of an improvement in performance of our Jamf instance at that point, because Tomcat didn't need all of the RAM ever. So,
Tomcat was a lot more zippy, which we all love. So, so once all this planning had been done, the change controls are all submitted, the migration day is here. So the process of that migration, the first thing we need to do is make sure that we've got an SSL certificate that can be used in Jamf Cloud for that URL that is going to be used for your Jamf Cloud instance. In your case, it is one of those vanity URLs. And so then we turn off Tomcat because we don't want to have both instances running at once. That's the last thing we want to see. And then we export the database from the on-prem instance. So we've got the last used database, and that gets uploaded into Jamf Cloud by our cloud engineering team. We do a DNS redirect so that all of the devices now know that they think they're checking into the same Jamf server, and they really are from a certain point of view. It's just it's now up here rather than over there.
this is my favorite haiku, by the way.
Shout out to Pam Lefkowitz for that one. Then we start Tomcat in Jamf Cloud, and we see what happens. Devices start checking in. We want to run some checks. We do things like, test enrollments, test policies are working, test MDM commands are working, a whole checklist that the Jamf Professional Services team have just to validate that everything has run successfully. Those validations passed. How did that go in terms of our change window that we had?
Look, I have to say that migration day was anxiety-inducing. Long story short, we had a couple of hiccups with the database export, so we had to do it a second time. And again, it's a large database, so we were being told that the process was going to take a while. We ended up at the end of our change window with less than a quarter of an hour remaining before we would have had to have started doing backout.
But we made it. We got there. So I think the important thing was that really validated that decision to take a staged approach rather than trying to do distribution point, identity, all of these sorts of migrations within that one change window. Separate those out and take the staged approach. It gives us now an ability to take stock and then start executing the remaining pieces of the project that we need to get where we are. So then we start executing the rest of the plan. So what did that look like?
Yeah, so some of the next steps that we were able to do ourselves, like migrating the distribution points from our existing AWS infrastructure into Jamf Cloud Distribution Service, that was fairly simple and straightforward. It was click a couple of buttons within the Jamf console. But we then engaged Jamf again for some assistance with migrating some cloud identity. We started off, we did the cloud identity as a two-stage migration where we started with console login for single sign-on with Entra ID. And then our enrollment and self-service, which we were still using LDAP via a Jamf infrastructure manager. I can say infrastructure today. I don't know why I couldn't the other day. And then we were able to turn off that gym and close the associated holes through the firewalls there as well. And then we get to the device compliance migration, the whole reason that we started this journey in the first place. And I will say that this compliance migration was a bit of a nail biter, but a massive shout out to Mark Adams from Jamf Support, who was really helpful and dedicated through the actual migration. Yeah, really helpful.
So we remember this one from back in the planning stage. So let's look at all of the additional opportunities that National Australia Bank's benefited from now that we've got into Jamf Cloud.
Yeah, so we really benefited from the migration. So I will point out that not everything here is dependent on Jamf Cloud. But as I said at the beginning, we saw this project as an opportunity to start embracing a lot more modern methodologies and kicking off with identity, especially when it comes to user identity, wherever that exists. It was very much about modernizing our platform and not just the way it was hosted. And then also being able to simplify and improve the end user experience by using Entra ID instead of LDAP, and then implementing single sign-on for enrollment and also self-service. Multi-factor authentication was a thing for during our onboarding, which also for our new starters means that they can set up all of their requirements fairly easily. And then right before we did our device compliance migration, we also enabled the Microsoft Enterprise Single Sign-On plugin, which actually streamlined the end user experience for the device compliance migration as well.
So that meant from a user experience, that then was seamless. That migration from the partner device management to partner compliance management was something that the users weren't aware of at all. That just happened in the background. So no more self-managed distribution points.
Yeah, so prior to our migration, we did have, as I mentioned before, Linux boxes sitting in our AWS infrastructure. And we obviously had to make sure that those were patched, manage the vulnerabilities, manage the network access, and there was also our change management framework overhead that came with that as well. So the Jamf Cloud Distribution Service really gave us a good win there in the amount of work that we were doing just to manage those distribution points.
Being able to have things like global availability, no more having to synchronize all of that content that was having to be performed manually before.
And for global availability, we were using our own Akamai to do some, similar to CloudFront, to do that distribution.
But once again, another thing that you're having to manage yourselves.
Absolutely.
So there were a few other things that you got access to as part of this migration.
Yeah, and so app installers here, these were really not part of the driving force to migrate at all, but they have added a lot of value that was a little bit of a bonus, I feel. It's important to understand, though, that app installers are not going to solve all of your software deployment requirements. We still have requirements to manually package some tools, even though they are in the Jamf app catalog, because of certain configuration payloads that we need to have inside the application installer when we lay that down on the machine.
So what are some of the scenarios where you've been using app installers?
One of the ways that it's actually really helpful is the really small volume limited use case apps. The best example I have is in an accessibility use case where we actually have one user that needs a particular app to be able to perform their role. And it's a lot easier for us to use a Jamf app installer for that rather than spend a whole bunch of time packaging that application and then push it out to one device when there's an update.
And especially, as you mentioned before, the users are not admin users, so anything they need is going to have to be performed by your department. As you said before, a relatively small department for the number of devices that you have, so that time to be able to get the applications and the updates that users want out to their machines, ensure that they're functional and they're secure. So, software updates. Who here loves managing software updates? Yes, we all love that. There was also some benefits with declarative device management in Jamf Cloud.
Yeah, absolutely. So we weren't doing anything particularly fancy prior to this. We weren't using Nudge, nothing like that. I tried it wasn't for me. But we were pretty much just pushing MDM commands and hoping for the best. I mentioned before, hope's not a strategy, so... But one of the great things that we have here, like declarations really seem to provide a lot more reliability for us to the point where we can almost set and forget it. But then when something does inevitably go wrong because we have a lot of machines, we have access to the event logs for auditing and troubleshooting to figure out why something went wrong on that machine and then figure out what the next steps are. I'm definitely looking forward to some of the blueprints and other DDM stuff that's coming that was demonstrated on Tuesday. So,
very, very exciting. So infrastructure management. It sounds like there's going to be some productivity gains that you got not having to manage all of that. So, how many hosts were you managing leading up to this?
Yeah, so I mentioned before we had our distribution points, some Linux boxes. We had 2 of those. It's just elastic block storage with Samba. We picked up the Windows file shares and dumped them into AWS on ABS. We also had our single Jamf Tomcat host, which was an AWS XL EC2 instance, which was not cheap. And that came down to Tomcat being a bit RAM hungry. And there was also an RDS to handle the MySQL database there. And there's all the change control around patching not only Jamf, but the individual boxes themselves that we had to deal. So not having that overhead has been really helpful.
And then also not having that spend in Akamai and AWS to deal with that. So
absolutely, it's Jamf's AWS and Akamai bill, not National Australia Bank's.
So you mentioned there was some responsiveness gains when you reduced the size of the database. So what did you find in terms of responsiveness moving into Jamf Cloud?
Yeah, so when we kicked off the project, there were some initial kind of trepidation, I guess, that Jamf Cloud wouldn't be as responsive as the setup that we had because we'd just thrown an extra large EC2 instance at it to try and make it performant. But once we got to the other side, I think the first full day that we had Jamf Cloud up and running, our service desk and tech lounge teams, these are our frontline user-facing support individuals that were helping out with unlocking machines, resetting passwords, and they were able to actually get that data more timely, though they were reporting a much more responsive console. And when they started saying this, I remembered back to my, it's now called the Jamf 300, but it was the CCA training when I did it, we could do Tomcat in a clustered environment, and I'd totally forgotten that until we saw that it was running in that.
But not having to even worry about that sort of stuff is really important. And so those resources that were worrying about that beforehand are now able to look at other things. So what are some of the things that you've got those resources looking at now?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that we have as a regulated industry, security is a very high consideration for us. Application control has been on our radar for a very long time. In Australia, we have the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. I always mess that up. And they publish an Essential 8, which is the 8 things that organisations should be doing to protect their data and their customers. It's essentially our own version of something like NIST. It's a government department just telling us how to manage our machines. So we've been implementing Santa, and one of my very talented engineers who put together all of the Terraform stuff. He was responsible for a lot of the stuff that we've done with Santa, and we're humming along really nicely with that. As I mentioned, we've also been able to start implementing things like the Enterprise Single Sign-On plugin to really start improving our end user experience.
And then that piece of work around the device compliance and being able to now manage that in Jamf so you can get that better end user experience. So what did we learn as a result of this process? It's nice to sort of look back and assess how we did.
Yeah, absolutely. And hindsight is 2020. And it's interesting to note that both Jamf and National Australia Bank, we learned from each other throughout this process. National Australia Bank had certain business requirements that that were able to kind of mature not only our processes, but Jamf's, and Jamf had processes that and requirements that led to us improving our process.
And the main thing about that was ensuring that we avoided any assumptions. So when something is new to an organisation that hasn't gone through a Jamf migration, thinking that that would work the same way as other migrations that they've done, and also for Jamf, making sure that we're documenting everything and providing clarity. And I think that clarity was really important. So there was a common understanding between both organisations as to exactly what was going to happen. And one example of that was the partner device management to partner compliance management, and ensuring that National Australia Bank understood that that was a one-way migration. It wasn't something we could do, decide that it wasn't working the way we wanted, and revert that change and try and do the change again another time.
Yeah, and not having a backout does complicate our change management processes. Not being able to stuff the genie back into the bottle becomes problematic when we're trying to plan these, and there's extra governance things that get triggered when we're doing that. But it was also good to find some gaps in our understanding and documentation, both for our side and for Jamf's side there.
And once again, we'll state that staging those changes so you aren't trying to do too much all at once. We have a lot of people saying that they want to do the on-prem to cloud migration and the LDAP to cloud identity at the same time. That can be done if you want to do things that way, but it's a much simpler and straightforward process if you do separate those out into different changes. Understanding those intricacies of migrating the LDAP, the partner device management to partner compliance management. And once again, we'll say your mantra.
Yes, one more time, and say it with me. Hope is not a strategy.
So looking back on this, we've gone through all of this evaluation, planning, and execution. And really, this is a statement we want to leave you all with. If this is something you can take home, then we feel like we've done our job.
Yeah, I really got this quote from Adam Savage stuck in my head while we were talking about the planning phase. And if you were in Rowan's neurodiversity talk and a lot of what he was talking about was resonating with you, I really urge you to burn this into your brain, because if you're going through all of these planning steps and not writing down the plan, you're not planning.
And this is where having project managers was essential. So I know I have so many meetings throughout the day, and it can be, quite easy to lose track of what may have been decided, what the outcomes of an early meeting was, depending on what the meetings were like later on. And having all of that information that we'd agreed in those meetings documented, written down, and shared amongst everyone was really the key to ensuring that everybody was aware what needed to be done next, when that needed to be done.
And like I said before, herding cats.
So now that we're here, what are some of the things that you're looking at in the future now that we're happily in Jamf Cloud using modern identity, all of those sorts of things?
Yeah, we've got a lot of opportunities coming up now that we're past the big hurdle. The first thing, as soon as I get back to Australia next week, we're currently still using Nomad. So we want to replace that with Jamf Connect. Obviously, Nomad, the GitHub project has been archived. It hasn't had an update in a fair amount of time. So, and there's also risks associated with having a potentially out-of-date piece of software. We are exploring platform single sign-on. There is an ask for us to essentially go to a passwordless future. We are aware that that's not necessarily where Platform SSO is at just yet, but we're really excited about the Platform SSO future and what that can offer for our users.
I think we all look forward to a future where we have as few passwords as possible, because passwords are bad. Yeah, so really, really enjoying where Apple is going with that, also where Microsoft is going with Platform SSO.
And I've been to a lot of sessions that talk a lot about telemetry and logging during this week, and it's really intriguing to me on a personal level. But I'm keen to explore what that might look like in our environment and how we can implement that to make our troubleshooting and resolution a little bit more streamlined.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening to that journey. As we said before, we've got Tim Tam's Australian delicacy for any questions. So does anybody have any questions?
All right, let's start with a quick round of applause for Marcus and Stu. All right, and I'm going to run the microphone around so the recording can capture your question. So show of hands, who's got one? We'll start with Steve.
Sure. Yeah, great presentation, thank you. And I'm in the education sector. It's not that I don't have availability to Entra ID, but I was just curious during your exploration, did you notice if you could do Google single sign-on at all?
I believe it was mentioned as a possibility. We're not a Google shop, so I couldn't tell you. Marcus might have.
I'll have to just double check exactly what we're talking about there. We'll talk about that one afterwards. Single sign-on can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different areas of Jamf Pro. So yeah, we'll catch up afterwards and we'll run through that.
All right. One more?
All right, thank you guys. So my question is about performance. So we've got on-prem, obviously. We're looking to move to Jamf Cloud in the future. What kind of control do you have over the performance within the Jamf hosted solution?
From our perspective, none.
Yeah, so I suppose when you say performance, what do you mean by performance?
Well, if it was kind of lagging, or if there was some kind of an issue, that's just you call support and say, hey, you know, it's kind of not performing well. We need to do something. Do you have any kind of say in, you know, the specs for your cloud instance or anything like that? If needed?
Most of that information is obfuscated to you, and I think the most important thing is to not see Jamf Cloud as being, not to see on-prem Jamf installs as being representative of how Jamf Cloud exists. It's very different in the way that it works. So I think more working with support, having premium support if you're high availability, Jamf Cloud Premium if you want to have your own instance where you have control of where upgrades and updates take place, and just working with customer success and support where if you're seeing a performance issue, let them know and they will do all the troubleshooting logs and work with you to resolve those issues. So that's sort of the level of control you have over it. Obviously, we want you to be having a great experience and having your instance running well. So you do get a lot of troubleshooting through those teams to try and work out why things maybe aren't working the way you want, and those sorts of things.
Is everything included when you move to Jamf Cloud as far as like the vanity domain name? Is that a part of the service or is that like an extra?
I think our favorite answer is it depends. There can be a lot of factors that will go into that, and I think it's really important to engage with your sales engineer, and they can work through all of the specifics for you.
Yeah, for our situation, we already owned that domain, and then we manage all of our own certificates as well, which adds a bit of complexity.
Yeah, Jamf Cloud Premium offers the ability to access change management logs, access logs, vanity URLs, timing your updates and upgrades, and certain things like that. But I think it's important to engage with your team and have a look at your specific requirements. That'll give you the best answer there.
A question, you're talking about the database bloat. Did you have to implement additional controls to keep your database from growing, and how does Jamf handle that if they see your database is like too big for their cloud?
So to some degree, the database size is no longer my problem.
That's our problem now. But
nice.
the cloud team, if we notice things are not going well. So back to the previous question, there are some performance issues. It's really like seeing the Jamf Cloud team as being like your own internal team. It's not like, well, talk to the hand, we're not interested. We want it to perform well. We want you to be having a good experience. We want you to stay being a customer and have a really great experience. So we'll let you know if we start to see things that are not great, and then we'll work with you to start trying to clean things up.
Yeah, so I also work in a financial field in a company in very high compliance here. We are finally moving from on-prem to cloud. In fact, Monday we have our 4-hour meeting. I wondered, we are taking the approach of moving our dev servers first to see what hiccups we're going to experience and then work on fixing it. Did you guys take a similar approach? Or did you have a dev or prod separately, or?
I wish. So our dev environment was not well populated, so we didn't have a lot of devices enrolled into dev to really get a full understanding of the problems and impacts that we were going to have. But that's absolutely the best way to do it.
And yes, very much so. I've done that with some subsequent migrations we've done where we have done that migration. We've even looked at things with some customers where we've actually looked at dummy uploads of their database to just see how that goes. Not going into a live environment because we don't want to have multiple instances running everywhere, but just that whole idea of staging and planning everything to make sure that we only see unforeseen issues in that 4-hour window, not foreseen issues in that window.
I was just curious about, excuse me, your overall downtime during the migration, and were you able to do it during business hours or after business hours?
Yeah, so we were able to do that during business hours, and that 4-hour engagement was kind of our hard stop for the downtime. So we were very clear to communicate not only to our support teams, but also to our end users that we were going to have a planned outage to complete the migration, that we were working as hard as we possibly could to minimize the impact to those end users and to the support teams, and that we would send, at least for the support teams, we would send further comms as soon as we had completed that migration.
And that was part of the planning process of making sure everyone was on the same page. So once again, with other customers, they've had a requirement of needing to do it out of hours for their particular business requirements, and making sure that there were no assumptions, talking about when's going to be the best availability for the technical staff who may need to be there to troubleshoot unforeseen things. Being in Australia, being in a different time zone to global areas of Jamf, just looking at all of the things that are on the table and assessing what's right for your particular organisation and make sure everybody's on board with that, as you said, communicating so that people aren't trying to enroll devices and getting tickets going, something's broken. No, it's planned, that sort of communication.
And the other two things I want to mention there, because we have operations in 3 different countries, 3 different time zones, there wasn't really going to be a good time out of hours for us to complete the migration as well. And then the second thing there is that for the most part, your end users won't even know that the Jamf server is down unless they launch self-service to try and run a policy.
And that was also that assessment that was made between doing a device migration, that whilst this would be a single point in time, and that was a concern we spoke about earlier, can we stage this migration? No, it's an all or nothing, but the benefit then would be that the users wouldn't be interrupted, and that was one of the main motivators for that. Is we didn't want those 5,000 users to be involved in the process at all. It was just a small group of people that got heavily involved in that process, and we absorbed all of that angst over the 4 hours. But then the end result was much better for the organisation.
So I'm curious to know if your organization had any sort of disaster recovery requirements as far as like having multi-regional options, because that's part of the benefit of being inside of AWS is that you can lift and shift if you need to. And I'm curious to know that if that was a requirement and how that impacted your abilities to move over to cloud, or what those conversations were like with your partners.
Yeah, 100% DR planning is a requirement for us in almost everything that we do because we want to minimise the impact that we have not just to our end users within the bank, but also to our customers. Thankfully, our Mac platform generally doesn't impact our customers directly, but there are still indirect impacts. I would say, again, to some degree, for us, the disaster recovery plan is Jamf's problem now.
But it's a problem that we're used to dealing with. We're used to dealing with organisations on that scale. We have all of those plans in place. We have them documented. So, work with your customer success sales engineering team, and they can provide you all of that documentation and planning. Some of it is publicly available. Some of it is not publicly available. So, as I said, work with them so that you can get all of that confidence you need, and to ensure that it meets your specific requirements, and then work through, anywhere where maybe they don't align the way that you want.
Yeah. So our requirement was really to have that documentation available to understand what, and that was part of those assessments that we spoke about.
Our disaster recovery plan is not going back to that. Hope is a strategy. We have a disaster recovery plan.
So those were all fantastic questions. So you can all grab a Tim Tam up here in front. One more round of applause for Marcus and Stu.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. If you have extra questions, they'll be hanging out. But thank you for coming to JNUC. Safe travels, and we'll see you next year in Denver.